If you had grown up on a Hebridean sea loch 800 years ago, the people who raised you might not be the people who made you, and nobody around you would have thought it strange. At first light, the water lay flat and grey, holding the shapes of the hills on the far side without a ripple to break them. A small boy stood at the edge of it, his hand held tight in someone else's. His name was Eachann, and he was perhaps 3 years old, too young to understand what the morning meant. He knew only that the walk had started early, and that his mother had not come. What was happening to him had a name, though he would not learn it for years. It was called fosterage in Gaelic, and it touched almost every free family in the Gaelic world. Children of free families were sent, often for years, to be raised in another household entirely. It was not punishment, and it was not abandonment. Families competed for the privilege of raising another family's child. A bond formed this way could outlast almost anything else in a person's life. Foster kin, in the sayings of the time, were held closer than blood. Eachann's walk that morning carried him over a ridge, away from the water he knew, toward a farmstead he had never seen. By evening, it was the only home he had. The farmstead sat low against the hillside, a long building of stone and turf with a roof that ran almost to the ground. In winter, the cattle came inside it too. This was not unusual. Across the Hebrides and the West Highland coast, households and their livestock often shared the same roof through the cold months, the animals helping to keep the building from freezing. For Eachann, the strangeness did not last long. Within days there were chores, and chores left little room for homesickness. He carried water from the burn. He gathered bracken from the hillside, armful after armful, to be laid down as bedding for the animals, and in the worst of the winter, for the people too. He minded the younger children of the household when the adults could not, which was often, since a farm like this ran on every pair of hands it had, including the smallest. The woman who ran the household, his Emwina, was not soft with him. She did not need to be. Her warmth showed in how completely he was folded into the family's daily rhythm, not in how gently he was spoken to. The real wealth of the household was outside, in the cattle. In the Highland economy of this period, cattle mattered more than almost anything else, more than grain, and far more than coin, which played little part in Highland life at all. A family's standing could be measured in the size of its herd, the way another family's might be measured in land, or in silver. Eachann learned to move among the cattle before he learned much else. How to walk so as not to startle a cow with the calf. How to read which animal in a group would move first, and let the rest follow. The days belonged to work. The evenings belonged to the fire. Each household of any standing kept or shared the visits of a shenarchy, a person whose entire function was memory. In a society that kept little in writing, the shenarchy held the genealogies, the descent of families back through generations, the deeds and disputes that explained why things were the way they were. Eachann sat at the edge of these gatherings, too young to be asked anything, and listened anyway. He could not have repeated a tenth of what he heard, but something was being built in him regardless, a sense that the people around him belonged to a story running back a long way, and that he was now, however small a part, inside it. Years passed the way they do for children, unevenly, a blur of winters broken by a summer that suddenly mattered. By the time Eachann was 12 or 13, he was trusted with something new. The cattle were going to the shieling, and so was he. Each year, as the early grass came in on the high ground, households moved their herds up from the glens to pasture that had stood empty all winter. The animals went up to graze. The people went with them, and stayed. For weeks, Eachann lived at the shieling with a handful of others his own age, in huts of turf and stone with barely room to lie down. There was milking to be done, morning and evening, and butter and cheese to be made from it, the whole reason for moving the herd up here in the first place. But between the milkings, the days were largely his own, in a way no part of his life at the farmstead had ever been. It was, by most accounts, the closest thing a Highland childhood had to freedom. That same summer, the weapons started. Not training for war. Nothing so deliberate as that. For any free-born boy, handling a blade, a spear, and a small shield was part of growing up, the same as handling cattle or reading the weather. He was shown how to hold what would later be called a dirk, a short single-edged blade. How to balance a simple spear. how to carry a small round shield, a torch, on the left arm. None of it was urgent. All of it was expected. The other boys at the shieling were rarely strangers. Most of them, like Eachann, had been fostered out from somewhere else, and the summers at the shieling were where those scattered ties knotted themselves together. A friendship made here, herding the same cattle through the same wet mornings, could matter for the rest of a life. In marriages, indexed owed and repaid, in which household stood by which when it counted. One of those summers, the weather turned faster than anyone expected. A storm came down off the high ground in the afternoon. Within the hour, the burn below the shieling, normally narrow enough to step across, was running brown and fast and rising. Cattle do not care for rising water. Several of them had wandered down toward the burn to drink before the rain came, and now stood uncertain at the edge of it. Eachann was one of the boys nearest. There was no adult close enough to call for, and the cattle were already moving the wrong way, toward the water rather than away from it. He did what he had spent years learning to do without ever being told it was a skill. He moved to the front of the group, slow and steady, and let the lead cow notice him before he tried to turn her. She turned. The rest followed, the way cattle do, and within a few minutes the herd was moving back up the slope, away from the burn, just as the water reached the place where they had been standing. Nobody made very much of it afterwards. That, in its way, was the point. This was exactly the kind of steadiness Eachann had been sent away to learn, and on a wet hillside, with no one watching closely enough to praise him for it, he had it. The shieling summers came and went for several years after that, each one a little less strange than the last. Each one ended the same way, with the herd driven back down to the farmstead as the high grass began to fail. Then, the autumn Eachann turned somewhere around 15, the herd went down to the farmstead as usual. He did not. His foster father told him, with no great ceremony, that it was time. The years of his fosterage were drawing to their formal close, and he was to travel to the household of his birth. He set out with a small escort, back the way he had come as a small child, though he remembered almost none of the route. The path took him back over the ridge. And then, ahead of him, was the loch. He was received at his birth family's hall the way any guest as standing would be received, with formality, with food set out, with a welcome that followed rules older than any one present. Hospitality, in Gaelic society, was not a courtesy that could be skipped. It was closer to an obligation, owed to guest and stranger alike, and a household's reputation rested on how well it was met. For a while, Eachann sat in his own family's hall as a visitor. He answered polite questions about a life they had heard about only in occasional news carried between households by whoever happened to be traveling. Then, gradually, the formality loosened. Someone laughed at something he said. Someone else passed him food without being asked. A guest, by the old rules, was owed hospitality regardless of who they were. A son was owed something else, something that did not need a rule to explain it. That evening, Eachann walked down to the shore alone. The water lay the way it had the morning he left it, flat and quiet, holding the shapes of the hills on the far side. The light was different now, the low gold of late afternoon rather than the grey of first light, and the figure standing on the shore was no longer small. What had carried Eachann through the years in between was never only the family he had been born to, it was also the family that had taken him in, fed him, taught him, and let him go again, exactly as their own households had once let their children go to be raised elsewhere. For centuries, in the glens and along the lochs of the Gaelic West, the strength of a household was measured not only in the children born to it, but in the children it had agreed, for a time, to call its own,